Hello and welcome. And in this section, I'm going to be talking about eDocs and AP Invoices and credit notes. First of all, what is it? It's the ability to import supplier invoices and credit notes and to use scraping. That's optional, but we'll cover that in more detail in a second, to speed up and reduce errors on inputting. Scraping can be done at either a header or a line level. So what are the benefits of this? Reduced paper flow. If you're receiving an invoice or a credit note electronically, there's nothing more time consuming than then having to print off that electronic document and then having to input it, scan it in, etc. You're recording that receipt of the AP invoice. So as well as not having to print it out, it's stored electronically. So that reduced paper flow also means that the paper doesn't get lost somewhere around an organization or even between just two desks. You can still maintain an approval process, but without the paper invoice being lost, as I mentioned. You can use scraping to let the system do, in quotes, do the work. Return supplier, pull off the invoice details, and the line details as well. We'll be covering that in detail. You'll see what all that means. There's an audit trail of the actions, so you can see what's going on at every step of the way. Okay, before I jump into the demonstration or the overview, there's several parts that I'm going to show you on this. The manual inputting of invoices. So in other words, no scraping. So you can still have eDocs for AP invoices and credit notes without any scraping. So you're just importing those documents either directly from an email address or with those documents being stored on a network drive. Scraping of invoices. This is the real plus side of eDocs and AP invoices. So the invoice is scraped. Coding of invoices. So as well as bringing invoices in, not having to print them off, etc., going through an approval process, there's some options around coding. Goes into quite a bit of detail, but I want to go around the options at an overview or a high level to discuss how this can work as well. With all that said, let's get on to the first part. The first option I want to demonstrate is that of what you might call manual coding, where you're kind of looking at the image and you're going to find the supplier, code the invoice, etc. So in other words, there's no scraping involved. So this is still an option, but obviously scraping has a lot more benefits to it. But let's go through the option of just having eDocs only. So an invoice is imported, again, via an email or a network drive or a combination of both. I'm just going to start off with one that I've imported here. So here's an invoice that's come in. Now without scraping, the system has no knowledge of who the supplier is, what the coding on it is, date of the invoice, etc., etc. So from here, I'm going to need to code everything up, but I can do this just by looking at the image beside me. So I might be putting in the invoice number. I'm not going to bore you too much with all the details that are going on here. I would need to look up the supplier. I'm just going to choose the first one just for expedience sake here. Now it's telling me, and I will cover this again later, duplicates. So it says, I think you may have seen this invoice before, which it probably has because I've worked it through as an example. But again, some more functionality of eDocs, it's recognizing that this may be a duplicate. As I said, I'll cover this before and what these different options are and how they work. But at the moment, I'm just going to continue. If there's a purchase order, we will talk about purchase order matching a little bit later on as well. I'm going to put the value of the invoice, You notice there it says including tax. So again, along with the eDocs functionality, it's going to look for this matched value here. This needs to be green. So we will also talk shortly about what the coding options are, but you'll notice that the coding here works slightly differently. And I've got a tab effect of what's going on here. I've got things called favorites and stock and purchase orders and PO receipts. You notice there's no jobs here. This may or may not be a job costing site. So when we talk about the coding options in a separate section, we'll talk about how these work in terms of the tabs and how they can be presented. Because we have things called supplier types, and these types sit alongside any given supplier. One of the observations that's always pointed out with the standard Greentree invoice entry is that everybody can almost see everything. Depending on what modules you've got, of course. I can see all the stock items, I can see all the jobs, etc., etc. It becomes difficult to look for things, even with using advanced search. And a lot of the time, not always for every supplier, but a lot of the time I'm just purchasing the same things, hence the concept of recently used. So, for this supplier, I've recently purchased these items. There's some GL stuff going on here, there's some inventory items, and there's some some jobs there. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail and how these tabs can be displayed, how they can be ordered, and how they work. But for the sake of moving this forward, I'm just going to select that. So again, you'll notice I didn't put any value in there. I just ticked that box because I put my value in up here. You can of course reduce it because it could be split over several lines. So for example, this might only be, simplistically, $25. And I might have the balance going on there. So it wants to look to ease this transaction or make it easier for me as possible to code it. Again, I've actually done very little there, just split my amounts, selected those, and it's green, it wants to match. Scraping, of course, has the ability to do all this for you, but we'll go through that shortly. What other options have I got here? Again, depending on the business process, I could submit for approval if this invoice was going off to be approved. Other than that, I've got a manual assign. You see I've got that duplication message again. So I can manually just assign it to someone. So this introduces the concept of I could send the invoice for somebody else to code it, because I might not know how those costs are split. Classic being it might be split, the invoice might be split over several jobs. I don't know what the split is because it just might be X number of materials, X number of time from a subcontractor, etc., etc., and the project manager might be splitting it up. So I could send it to him or her. And the next thing is I can go straight away and create the AP invoice. So remember this is still an eDoc transaction. No general ledger transactions are created by me doing this coding. It's only when you create that AP invoice that it forms part of your accounting entries that go through as per standard Greentree. So I'm just going to come out of that for a second. So a brief recap. I've imported that invoice in. I coded it. I needed to look up who the supplier was. I need to look up who the supplier was, the invoice number, the values, etc. I could then send it for approval, or I can just go create an AP invoice from that, forms part of my AP processing. And we'll talk about how these entries can work and how you can maximize those. So in the second option, I want to demonstrate the scraping of the invoice. At this stage, just at the header level. So the invoice will be scraped, and what that means, it's going to pick up as much details from the header part of the invoice as it can. So it's going to pick up the supplier if it can, the invoice date, the amount, any PO that might be on the invoice. Anyway, you'll see it in action, but it's going to pick up that information. So also at this point, what I want to do is introduce, I'm going to send this invoice to an email address. So previously in all the overviews and demos I've shown, I've just been putting them in a network folder. So at this point, I'm going to send it. So it's coming in, I've just got an email address there, but it could be ABC Limited, and it's coming into an address there. That address is being used to poll in my AP invoices. So you would need a different email address for statements, supplier statements, customer remittances, etc. We'll talk about the setup separately. So this is an email coming in from an external address. There's the invoice as an attachment. Off it goes. In terms of my workflow desk, I'm just going to pick up, see if anything's ready to come in. Hopefully I've got the timing right on this, and you'll see that invoice appear. eDoc transaction 135 is in the scraping process. Once the invoice has been scraped, and this can depend on timings as to how long this may be, it will disappear off the being scraped workflow desk panel there, and you'll see that 135 is over here with the status of ready for coding. We haven't talked about statuses in any detail yet, but these are user defined, but this so the invoice has been scraped, ready for you to complete the next step. I've filtered these out here by type, but let's go into this transaction. I'll just make that a bit bigger so it's easier to see there. And I'll switch off line matching because we'll cover line matching in the next stage. And in the interest of being straight up and honest here, I have switched off that duplicate check-in that we saw earlier. So you may notice that there's no duplicate message. That's because I just didn't want to see the message being displayed all the time. So the invoice arrived into a dedicated email address. It went after scraping, got scraped. So as yet, I haven't really touched this invoice to any degree from an accounts payable perspective. But what's happened here? It's picked up my invoice reference for me. Now this might actually be scraping the wrong field. We can talk about that. It's picked up my supplier. It's picked up my invoice date. It's got a PO reference that it's pulled through from the invoice. It's got a value that it's pulled through. So at this stage, because it's just at a header level, that's getting to the level of what it will find for that invoice. So again, I haven't touched anything here, so it's ready for me to code. If these bits of information are correct, this is just an eDoc transaction at the moment with the type of being an AP invoice. So I can still change any of these details if they're incorrect, or if I want to. Also at this point, depending on what my business process might be, I can code the invoice. We're going to talk about these tabs, which I mentioned earlier on in the kind of manual process earlier. I can submit it for approval if I'm approving my eDocs. Remember, it's not an AP invoice yet. I can manually assign it. So again, I don't actually have to code this invoice to any degree. We have got a concept of sending this invoice to someone else for them to code it and send it back again. So I'm going to assign it. Who do I want to assign it to? And I can just create the AP invoice. And I may have an approval process based on that AP invoice. Again, that will depend on what your business processes are. In terms of actually coding this, remember I showed you before about how I'm just going to, if that's all I need to do. So all I've done is tick a select box there. That might be what it is. Partial again. So it's always looking to balance that transaction for me. I'm just going to do that. But if I'm ready, then I could create my AP invoice or send it through approval. So what are some of the other things that can go on here? I've got several options: bank account, tax number, and email address. So in other words, it has found the supplier based on the email address. So there's quite a few options we can get here, and we'll talk about those as well. We can validate on all those. So it's looking on the invoice to determine who that supplier is. Okay. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to touch on and talk about these tabs and this coding. So far with the manual coding of an electronic invoice that's been pulled in, or an invoice here where we've used the scraping at a header level to pull these details in. In terms of my demonstration, I've pretty much taken the easy approach here and just selected some of these, being what's available on the recently used tab. So again, I touched on earlier about with recently used, it's storing for that supplier what I've purchased from them recently, goes without saying. But then we have a concept of requisition types, favorites, stock, eDocs PO, so you'd need to refer to the eDocs PO video to talk about that in more detail, purchase orders, PO receipts, and PO additional charges. Pretty much reading out what it says there, but there's no job costing there. If I'm a job costing site, there's no job costing mentioned there. There's no general ledger codes there that I can see at all. So these are what is referred to in terms of eDocs setup as supplier types. So you can have different supplier types, meaning that different suppliers can see or might be made available to them different options when coding. One of the criticisms of standard Greentree is that when you go into the AP Invoice entry screen, it's just a bit of a blank template. So in other words, depending on my security access and what modules you've got in Greentree, it can depend on what's available, but you'll see everything. I can't limit that down to any degree. And for a lot of suppliers where you're buying the same or repetitive items from them, it can be a bit tiresome and lead to miscoding. This is where eDocs, or one of the benefits of eDocs, comes in. So let's look at a little bit more, or give you an overview of these supplier types and then how they work. So as part of the setup of eDocs, got these supplier types. So you'll see these tabs here, quite familiar with the tabs you see across here. I've got different types. You can have as many types as you like. Obviously, like with anything, while you think, well, this might be great, don't tie yourself up in knots about how this might work. If I look at what this one here called all options, for no particular reason, I'm going to look at this one, but I happen to know that this supplier that we've pulled on here, Supplier 2000, has this option assigned to it. I'll show you how you can get to that in a second. But first of all, the basics are, am I allowed to see the recently used tab? And what's my sequencing? So not only with these tabs here am I controlling what I can see at a possible supplier level, but more likely a group of supplier levels, I then can also control what sequence those are in. Excuse me. So I've got requisition types, tab 2. My favorites is tab 3, and it's allowed, of course. So then I can control it. So with all options, I'm not seeing job. Now I may not be a job costing site, but also I only want certain people, or certain suppliers, I should say, sorry, that's relevant to. If I just have a look at another one that's set up here, insurance services, a little bit generic, but I'm allowed my recently used, my requisition types, no purchase orders, no favorites allowed, no stock, no jobs. So in other words, there's not much going on in terms of insurance services. So the supplier that I'm doing any insurance services with, or I group together, let's have a look what suppliers they are. There's the suppliers there. So just when you thought, Oh no, I might have to go and allocate supplier by supplier. You've got the standard green tree arrow and group back and forward. Let's flick back to all options, and you'll see all the suppliers assigned to all options are all those ones. So on that basis, just going to jump into the supplier itself. It also sits on the supplier, so you don't have to maintain them in bulk. My eDocs tab on my setup, there's my supplier type there, matching those ones there. So if for a new supplier, you can assign it as part of the setup process for new suppliers, but this obviously gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of what you're showing for a supplier. Recently used. So recently used would be key in most instances for suppliers. But here we are in terms of we can control what's displayed. Because you think, how's that recording that? Well, I've got recently used, show my last 20 invoices. But it could be by a fixed number or over a time period as well. Some suppliers you only might receive an invoice once every couple of months, once a year. So therefore you can control what's going on with that and how much is actually displayed. So then, going back to where we started with, if I was just bringing an invoice in, if I was looking at that insurance services one, hopefully I can find it easily here, insurance house. Whoops, user error there. You'll notice now suddenly that my tabs that are displayed are quite different to the other supplier. This makes it, again, cuts down on errors, makes it relevant that I only see the information I need to see, and therefore just easier to use rather than having the whole list assigned to me. There's a find function as well if you need to. Again, this is looking for all codes, names and descriptions. Okay, well I hope that's been a good summary of the scraping of an invoice and the introduction of what supplier types are and how they can use to also make it efficient to into your invoices. In the next option I want to demonstrate, I want to show the scraping of an AP invoice, this time at a line level. So previously we looked at an invoice being scraped. It was picking up the supplier and the details at the header level of the invoice, such as the date, the amount, the supplier itself, etc. So now I want to do a line level. So again, I'm going to use, coincidentally enough, I'm going to use the same invoice, but I'm going to email. So this email is coming into my given email address for receiving invoices. Sorry, I got my words out. Invoice comes in. I'm going to show the process, but also I'm going to show it coming in and picking up the lines. Off it goes. That's coming externally in from a supplier in my example here. Invoice comes in. There it is being scraped straight away. After it's been scraped, the status changes, disappears from the being scraped box on my workflow desk, and there's transaction 145 and it's ready for coding, or the status that I give invoices in this instance as to what happens next. I'll come into this invoice. As I mentioned earlier, it's the same invoice, so therefore on that basis, it's scraped those header details the same in this instance. There's my invoice number, my invoice date, it's found the supplier. Based on that script that was looked it up by email address there, it's pulled in the amount. The difference is here on this example now is we've got the line matching box ticked, and here, just bring that up a bit, here's the lines that it's scraped from said invoice. So there's a concept of all lines, unmatched lines, and match lines. Now at this point I haven't run the auto match process going on here, so it hasn't done anything. Goes without saying, I guess. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on the auto match, and it's told me my invoice is on hold, so there's no lines to match. So in this instance, now I kind of knew this would happen because I've raised a purchase order and it's gone on to approval, but I just wanted to demonstrate in this instance that at least still checking, it's checking against that purchase order because it wants to pick up the lines on that purchase order. Again, this may be stating the obvious, but if there wasn't a purchase order on this invoice, it would go through as I'm about to show you. I'm just about to go and take this PO off on hold, well, just to prove it notionally, so we can then match it accordingly. So standard green tree is still applying here, so it hasn't matched anything. Okay, just behind the scenes there, I've actually approved that purchase order. Don't need to show you that process at this stage of the game. So I'm just going to run the auto match again. Okay, 3 out of 4 lines are matched. Let's have a look at what it's done. So if I look at the unmatched lines, it can't find freight. We'll talk about how it matches these in a second. There's no value on the freight anyway. Let's just have a look at this invoice. There is no freight there anyway. Somehow on this invoice, line 4 has come through, but it's got 0 value of freight for whatever reason on this particular invoice. Let's have a look at the matched lines. So there it's matched those inventory codes, it's scraped those inventory codes from my invoice, these ones here, and these are the ones that it's matched to, and it's told me what it's matched to here. Inventory line, matched to that, matched to that, matched to that. Okay, the other thing you'll notice that's happened here is this purchase order tab has been highlighted, indicating that it's matched those against them. And there we go, nicely highlighted those. Please don't look at the costs in too much detail because I've just matched against some inventory items where the cost was significantly different, but it's the principle of what I want to show you here. So how does it know what to match and what it's done? Let's go into the supplier. So there's a bit of setup involved. In effect, all it's doing is a lookup. If only it was that easy in terms of what it's doing, but let's have a look here. So I've come into my supplier itself, onto the eDocs tab, the setup, and into the line mapping. And you'll see here that I've got some matching going on. So here's the text. I've just chosen some random items, but on them, these are the text that I've picked up from the invoice, just to show this demonstration, but this could be a long line of stock items that I'm getting here from the supplier. What type is it? So standard green tree applies. Just as a demonstration or an example here, I've mapped a job here. So I've said, well, it could be called Grafton Street. It's a job. It's matched to that job. And there's the description of what comes in. Sorry, that's the description of the job. My apologies. I can make things inactive if I need to. So it's saying, and here's the stock item that it's matched against. So match text, that's the text on the supplier invoice, equals that inventory code in my system. And hence how that match is done. I've then gone auto match, it's matched those. The matched value is not quite right. I'd need to go and find out what's going on there and do any recoding if necessary. At that point, I can either assign it to someone, I can submit for approval if I've got an approval process hanging off this still, even though it's matched to a purchase order. Depends where your approvals are happening. Or I can just create an invoice, create the AP invoice. If I want to add some additional things on, there's a freight code that I don't know about, hasn't picked up, for example, or they've changed the code on their invoice and therefore the line matching's not working, any number of things. I could come into my requisition types here, and I might be deciding, let's have a look, let's find freight, and there it is there. I'm going to put in whatever my value might be for freight. If I go, hopefully I got this right, and then process the invoice accordingly. Okay, so just a recap then of the process we've gone through. The invoice has arrived from the supplier. It's gone into a direct inbox. That inbox has been scraped. It's come here, it's gone through the process. It's appeared on my workflow desk. I've gone into the invoice itself. I've auto-matched it, seen what's matched, it hasn't picked up. So all I'm really doing there is picking off the differences of what's happened. I'm not looking to do any coding if it comes from a purchase order. Of course, it doesn't have to come from a purchase order. Again, it would still scrape those lines. In this instance, it's doing that double check of matching it against a purchase order. I don't want to save that at the moment. So I hope that's been a good overview of how line scraping can work. Thanks for your time. So in this very last section, I just want to cover off a slight addendum, if you like, to the line scraping option. So I've scraped this invoice that we've been looking at again, only this time I just want to make it a bit less complicated and just show you simply, if there's no PO, how the line scraping works. So I've done the same thing, sent it off for scraping, it's come in, here's my invoice, there's no PO being scraped this time. All the lines are here and they're all unmatched. Sorry, I'll just move that up so it's a bit easier. So again, but the line matching principles still apply in terms of it's looking for the supplier to match that text. So I'm just going to hit the auto match on this instance. It's matched all 4 lines. Again, here's what's matched on. It's matched my freight line, even though there's no value, because I did have it there. But also I didn't get any warnings about a PO, or the other thing, of course, that can happen, PO is not highlighted there, and it's simply, all it's done is looked at my recently used items, because it falls into those rules for the recently used. That's highlighted in blue, indicates that it's selected some there. Let's put those at the top. There it is there. So it's just pulling those lines, not comparing it, matching it to any PO, because it's not relevant in this instance. So just to wrap up, you can still use line scraping against an invoice. You don't have to have a PO. Obviously, it becomes a business process, and those rules apply about how you're using POs, whether they've been approved, matched, etc. So line scraping definitely has value if you've got a lot of lines coming in on an invoice and you're looking to speed up that process, make it more efficient, ensure that everything is matched off better. Anyway, thanks for your time on this last little section.